We had a lady who we met who'd lost her daughter in the mass of chaos and uncertainty on that border. And subsequently, a sergeant major from my engineer regiment came up to me and said, "I think we've found Iona. I think we've found this little girl." To be honest, I need to be careful what I'm saying here, but actually, in a way, breaking international law, because I moved from Albania into Macedonia and got my helicopter, put the little girl in the helicopter. They got hold of the mother and the two other little children that she had, and brought this little girl into the tent. And I tell you, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. I mean, it was just a wonderful, wonderful moment.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Guillebaud with Inspired. It's great to be back for another fantastic week of hearing a wonderful life story. Basically, if you're new to us, I am sick to death of being relentlessly bombarded by a narrative in the press that it's negative. It induces fear and cynicism and angst and anxiety, and that's the last thing we need. You know, when you watch the news or listen to the news, you're letting someone else curate all the bad stuff going on in the world. And yes, there's loads of bad stuff, but there's also loads of good stuff, and there's great people that have lived life well, and I've got no doubt that you're going to be inspired this week because we've got with us Major General Tim Cross, CBE. I know you're not worried about those labels, Tim, but it's great to have you on.
Thank you, Simon. And you're quite right. I often say to people, stop listening to the news and the media because they always tell us we're all going to be dead by Friday. It's a very negative world we live in, and it's great to be involved in, hopefully helping to inspire people and to bring them closer to the good Lord.
Yes, wonderful. Well, I'm not going to go through your CV because if I read out your whole CV, that'd be half the podcast gone. But you served in Northern Ireland. You're involved very close up in the Balkans conflicts. That's Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, in the Gulf War. About 36 years in the military itself, and then post-military, very involved in being quite outspoken in terms of some of the stuff that took place, but very engaged with the media. You've got so much to talk about. So let's just get cracking. Let's go back to, childhood, pretty steady, regular childhood.
Yeah, very much so, actually. I suspect, like a lot of people, I would say that I was raised in a Christian household, and my parents would say they were Christians. But the honest truth is we very rarely went to church. Mum and Dad never spoke about Jesus. And to be honest, Jesus wasn't a part of my life in all of those years. I was actually adopted by my father. He worked for Shell, and he married my mother. And we went to Australia in 1952. We're there for 4 or 5 years and then came back. And then we were basically in the UK. His 2 sons from a previous marriage, his wife had died, had been born in Trinidad, and he traveled all over the world with Shell. So it's a very happy, contented childhood, very happy with my, with schooling and all the rest of it. And having said that, I didn't do particularly well at school. But no, Jesus and the church was periphery, really. Although we would have said, as I say, that I was raised in a Christian household.
Actually, you say you didn't do well at school. Let me just tell us what you got, because it's just encouraging, because you've obviously done really well in life. But for people listening that aren't good at school, tell us about what you got in your O-levels and A-levels.
Yeah, well, I think it's really important, actually. I mean, the bottom line is I left school with 2 O-levels, one in English literature and one in geography. Both, geography was grade 3, which was my best, and English literature, I think, was a 6. In those days, the O-levels scoring was different. I then went to an army college, and to be honest, it's incredible I got in there, really. And I did A-levels there, and I creamed through 3 grade E A-levels, just creamed through these 3 A-levels. Then went to Sandhurst, which we might come back to, and did some stuff there. But then, and I think the answer was that really I just wasn't interested in academics, really. I was an outdoor sort of bloke. But then I realized I needed to get some qualifications to do some of the work I wanted to do in the military. So I ended up getting an upper second Bachelor of Science degree and then a master's degree. So I often say to my children and grandchildren, don't peak too early. There's plenty of time, plenty of time to focus in on academics when you know what it is you really want to try and achieve. And leaving school, I think, today, to be honest, apprenticeships are brilliant. I think far too many people go to university. And I think encouraging people not to worry and sweat over these early exams, is not unimportant. Clearly, for some people, it's right and important, but not for me.
So you mentioned Sandhurst. So for US and other listeners, West Point would be the equivalent over there. So it's the sort of elite military leadership academy, isn't it?
Yeah. It's changed, obviously. I was there yesterday, actually, and I was reminded of a couple of things, really, which is I was there for 2 years, from 1969 to 1971. I really enjoyed it. I'd been an army cadet. That's all I ever wanted to do, really, was join the military, although I didn't come from a military family. But Sandhurst was great. And it is a Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. It is a place where we commission all of our young officers into the British Army. But most importantly, it has a very strong Christian roots and traditions, as does the British Army as a whole, actually. The hat badge at Sandhurst says serve to lead, which is, of course, straight out of Philippians. And the prayer at the Academy at Sandhurst is this: Almighty God, whose Son Jesus Christ, the Lord of all life, came not to be served, but to serve, help us to be masters of ourselves, that we may be servants of others, and teach us to serve to lead. And being taught to do that and to love our soldiers was really important part. And it was actually at Sandhurst, and I really, looking back, I have no idea why. I just wanted to get confirmed. And I was confirmed at Sandhurst, which was quite unusual. But I think the Academy Chapel was brilliant. That prayer meant an awful lot to me. The hat badge, which we wore every day, meant a lot. And it was a great time.
Give us, I've had other friends that have gone through it and have told horrendous stories of how they put through their paces. They basically try to break you down to see whether you've got what it takes. Give us some of your crazy stories there.
Well, that's true. But for a reason. At the end of the day, when you commission out of Sandhurst, you're basically being trained to be a platoon commander of a platoon of soldiers, about 30 strong, to fight on a battlefield and to go off on operations around the world. And therefore, for the first 10 weeks at Sandhurst, to use a phrase, you're beasted. You're pushed around the drill square. You go out on exercise. You get cold and wet and hungry and frightened occasionally. And you have sergeants and staff sergeants who, from the British Army, the regular serving people, who are, first-class, brilliant people. But their job is not to break you, but the job is to put you under real pressure, because it's only when you're under real pressure that you really begin to understand, going back to that prayer, to understand who we are in ourselves. And when you're under pressure and you begin to see the reality of that, then they're able to mold you. It's rather like that great prayer, Jesus would break us and mold us and so forth. You're learning to train soldiers as well as yourself. You're learning how to understand who you are, because it's only when you're under pressure that you begin to really understand who you are. And when you're under pressure, then, the real you begins to emerge. I often say to people, I'm not a nice bloke to know in a traffic jam. Because I'm not in control. And if I'm not in control and I'm under pressure, I react in certain ways. I like to think I'm much better than I was, back in those early days. But Sandhurst is about that. It's about not trying to break you and break you apart, but learn to teach you how to react under pressure and how to control yourself in order that you can then lead and control other people. It's a big issue. We could spend a long time talking about it. But I loved it. I had a great 2 years at Sandhurst.
You ended up in, we can't cover everything you did, but Northern Ireland, you had some close scrapes there, did you?
Yeah, I when I was commissioned, I did my in-service degree, going back to our earlier point about getting a degree. And I then did, after a couple of years, I did what's called the Ammunition Technical Officers course, which, amongst other things, included bomb disposal, dealing with terrorist bombs and so on. And as a result of that course, I then went straight to Northern Ireland, where I ran a thing called the Ammunition Inspectorate, which meant I went around the province checking ammunition storage, looking at safety issues, and then disposing of ammunition that people found in their gardens or was washed up on the beach. People would have grenades that Grandpa had in World War I on their mantelpiece and suddenly realized that maybe this was a bit dangerous. But also it involved going out and dealing with terrorists, improvised explosive devices, IEDs as we call them, in Belfast and around that part of Northern Ireland. But I travelled all over the province. It was in the 1970s. In the early 1970s, and I think people can forget this, we lost 300 members of the security services a year in the early days. Killed by the IRA and indeed other terrorist organisations, and a lot of civilians. And some pretty terrible, terrible things. And it was the first time, really, that I began to think through issues like sin and evil and what the heck's going on here and why do people do this to each other? I wasn't a Christian at the time. We'll come back to that later. But nonetheless, it was an awakening for me in many ways.
And you had some close shaves?
Yeah, for the first time, I mentioned earlier on that sometimes, at Sandhurst, you were under pressure and got a bit fearful. But yeah, for the first time, I was afraid. I mean, I'm never afraid to admit that, that I was afraid. Fear, of course, is an important and absolutely integral part of being courageous. If you're not fearful, you're not afraid of something, then you're not displaying courage by dealing with it. But often the most fearful time was when you're sitting in the operations room waiting for the telephone to ring in order to go out and do some sort of job that needed to be dealt with. And sometimes the fear was pretty intense. And dealing with that and learning to deal with that, was an important part of being able to do what we then did. I mean, I never had any major incidents to deal with, but there were certainly times when I was afraid. I mean, we used remote vehicles, what they call wheelbarrow, to go up and look at these things. But eventually, you had to put on a heavy suit, unarmored suit, and go up and approach things and then deal with them. And it was. It was exciting. The adrenaline flowed, and it was a great tour. And I loved it in many ways, but it was tough occasionally.
I remember seeing two undercover policemen being caught in a crowd and dragged out the car and lynched.
Yeah.
I mean, you got lost one time, didn't you?
Yeah, indeed. Indeed, and there were famous two young soldiers who were exactly that happened to. They were dragged out and murdered terribly. I mean, there's some pretty brutal people out there. It's a fallen world, and evil and sin are not interesting theological words for me. They're a reality of a broken and fallen world, and dealing with people in Ireland, but also dealing with people like Saddam Hussein and Milosevic and all the other hoods. That's the reality, sadly.
Yeah. Well, let's get up to your sort of coming from beyond, I suppose, morality, churchianity to Christ, Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think you were in Cyprus. You got leave. You got to go to Jerusalem.
Yeah. It was a United Nations tour, peacekeeping in Cyprus, and got the weekend off. And I managed to get 2 seats on a UN flight flying from Nicosia in Cyprus, which is where we were based, to Jerusalem. There were lots of UN peacekeeping missions in that part of the world at the time, in Sinai and various other places, Golan Heights and so on. So Christine, my wife, and I managed to go over there, and it was the Easter weekend, 1981, and we stayed in a hotel in Jerusalem. Went over on the Thursday, I think, Good Friday. We sort of walked around, went to Bethlehem, did the sort of tourist stuff, really, and then went to the Anglican Church in Jerusalem for Easter Sunday service, which was a lovely service, and I remember it very well. But interestingly, over coffee. And this, I think, is a great message for anybody who is chatting to anybody, in any circumstance, really. But over coffee, somebody said to us, "Have you been to the Garden Tomb?" Now, I'd never heard of the Garden Tomb. But coincidentally, we'd walked past it the day before. And when they explained where it was, I thought, yeah, I know where that is. So they encouraged us to go. Christian and I went that afternoon. And the guide that day was a retired British Army colonel, which is an extraordinary coincidence or God incidence. I was a young captain. And we went in. It was a very peaceful place. This was a long time ago, as I say. It's now much more. I think more and more people know about it, so it's much busier. But anyway, he showed us around, and we sat down, and he opened up the Gospels, and he turned to John's Gospel, and he talked us through why this was possibly the place, in his view, the place that Jesus was buried. And there was a first century tomb. There's also a wine press. It's outside the city wall. There's a big rock formation that looks like a skull. Lots of good stuff that resonates with John's Gospel in particular. But then he said to me, "Look, this may or may not be the place." He said, "I happen to believe it is." And he said, "This may or not be the place. But if you go and look in that tomb, the tomb is empty." And feeling a bit of an idiot, I stood up and walked over to this tomb. I don't know what I expected to find. But anyway, as I leant on the sort of entrance to this tomb, I suddenly found myself thinking, this is actually quite an important question. If that tomb was not empty on that first Easter Sunday, then hundreds of millions, billions of people have completely wasted their time in following Christ. I mean, Paul says in one of his letters, if Christ did not rise from the dead, then we amongst all people are to be pitied. So, if that was the case, then, forget it. If, however, he did rise from the dead on that first Easter Sunday, then everything has to change. I mean, it was a mixture of an emotional Damascus Road type experience, but actually I then had to take it away and struggle with it for a while. A great friend of mine, General Ian Jury, who I served with in the Gulf War, used to say that most people become Christians by going down the M1 or the M2. which are two motorways in the UK, for those of you who don't know the UK. The M1, he says, is the Damascus Road, 1M in the word Damascus. And the Damascus Road is a heart-driven emotional response to suddenly meeting Christ. And it's a heart business. The M2 is the Emmaus Road, two M's in the word Emmaus.
Okay.
And the Emmaus Road is when Jesus meets the two disciples, or they meet him, on the road to Emmaus after the crucifixion and the resurrection. And Jesus opens up the scriptures and explains to them why what happened had to happen. And so the M2 is a head intellectual analysis, if you like, whereas the M1 is a heart-driven. Now, the truth is, looking back on it, again, for those who don't know, we have a motorway called the M25, which goes all the way around London in a big circle. And I'd been on the M25 all my life, going round and round in circles when it came to spirituality. And Ian used to say, you can get off the M25 and get on the M1 or the M2. So I'd had that experience of looking in the tomb, and then I had to take it away, because I am a head-driven man, really. I'm more of a head man than a heart man. I like to think I've got a heart, but, I'm more of a head man. So I had to take it away and analyze the scriptures. And about 3 or 4 months later, I just decided, I think like many men, we need to be given a bit of a kick and told, get off the fence and make a decision. And so I just decided I wanted to become a disciple of Christ. And it just transformed my life. I mean, it was a clearly, and it happened to be my 30th birthday that day in the Garden Tomb. So it was a pretty special day for me.
So I think your wife had already become a follower of Jesus a few months before. Was there massive change? I mean, you're already sort of an upstanding moral person, but did the language clear up, that sort of thing?
Well, I don't know about an upstanding moral person, but Christine didn't have that same experience in the Garden Tomb, but she had been attending a Bible study with a very, very good padre, and around the same time, she had made her own commitment. So it was a wonderful, coming together in that sense. How much difference did it make? Well, it clearly made a big difference in our approach and in terms of taking the scriptures seriously and beginning to try and learn more about what does it mean to be a Christian. Now, for me personally, the first issue was, can I stay in the military? Is God calling me out, having called me, to become a disciple? So I had to go through the scriptures, work my way through, and make that decision. And that involved, again, a long story, clearly, but when I analyzed the scriptures, what I found very quickly is that there's nothing in scripture that says you shouldn't be in the military. I mean, John the Baptist baptizes soldiers. When they say to him, what must we do to be saved? I always think, rather unfortunately, says, be content with your pay. But what he was saying is, don't misuse your power. Cornelius, of course, is the famous story. The centurion who meets Jesus, and Jesus heals his servant and says to the people around him, he never found faith like that anywhere else in Israel. And so on. There are lots of stories of soldiers, centurions, Roman soldiers, occupying power soldiers, who are, held up really. And Paul uses a lot of military language in his letters, particularly to Timothy and others. So I was quite clear that I should stay. I felt no desire to leave. I was, to be honest, I was pretty good at my job and I enjoyed it. And I felt I'd got a good career in front of me. So I didn't feel any desire to leave. But then I had to decide, okay, what does it now mean to be a Christian in the military? What does that look like? And then I studied, you won't be surprised to know, Joshua, great leader, great military leader, leading the Israels to secure the promised land. Gideon in his battle against the Midianites. And indeed, people like Cornelius. And from those stories, what I found myself thinking is, first of all, Joshua is a great example. When Joshua meets the man dressed in armor before the Battle of Jericho, asks him, are you on our side or on the enemy's side? And of course, the man replies, neither. I'm not on your side, Joshua, and I'm not on their side. The question is, are you on my side? God is not a mercenary to be summoned to fight my battles. The question is, am I on his side? Am I striving to serve him in doing whatever it is that he's calling me to do? Gideon's story of it resonates with, not by strength or by might, but by my spirit, as God reduces Gideon's army from 32,000 strong to 300. And he goes on to fight a brilliant maneuver warfare battle. And so I became very clear and very, very clear that I should stay, but I should strive to serve. And then going back to that Sandhurst motto, serve to lead God as my commander in chief, if you like, my new boss, and serve my soldiers as best I can as a Christian leader. And it was quite a long process. But I'm glad I went through it because it gave me the confidence and security that I was in the right place and should continue to serve.
And you ended up leading literally tens of thousands of men as a major general. But, in these early days, I mean, well, share some stories of your interactions with men and seeing them come to faith.
Yeah, well, of course, that was 1981, and the 80s were, of course, a period of the Cold War. So I did another couple of tours in Germany where we were preparing to fight the Warsaw Pact and so on. And my faith then began to mature. I went to a very good church run by a guy I'm still in touch with in Germany, and just began to grow and mature in my faith, began to really enjoy and love the scriptures. And then in the 1990s, of course, it was the year of the Balkans, and I did 3 tours in the Balkans. And again, being with soldiers in operations, seeing the reality. And the first Gulf War, of course, was in the 1990s. So watching mass graves being dug up. And I remember leaving a place in the Balkans in Bosnia with a young soldier who was my driver. And as we left this village, he said to me, I'm glad we're out of there. It sort of felt, there was a sort of spiritual darkness. He didn't use that word, but that's what he was alluding to. And so I chatted to him about it. I said, that's again the reality of sin and evil. These things are real. That's what we're dealing with in these places. So, being on operations with soldiers is a great opportunity to talk about these issues. I never felt it was my job to preach at them or beat them over the head with the Bible. I mean, what I needed to be was a good example of a Christian leader, and there would be opportunities that would open up when they would ask me questions. And they did a lot. People would ask me, do I read my Bible every day? What do I think about what's going on here? What? And they ask themselves the same questions, trying to work their way through what on earth was happening, what they were seeing. When you watch the mass graves being dug up, it makes you ask some pretty serious questions about the reality of a broken world. So there were times when that was a great opportunity to do that, and I don't think you necessarily see the results of that immediately. But just 2 stories, really. One is a young lady who was a lieutenant when I was a company commander, called Helen. And Helen was sent by the commanding officer to come and work with me for a month or so as part of her initial development. And we had 2 little children at the time, and she very kindly babysat for me on occasion. And we had a few conversations, and I chatted with her about some of the experiences. About probably 30 years later, I got an email from Helen, who was living in Stornoway. And she emailed me to say, I just wanted you to know that I was thinking of you the other day. My marriage has broken up. My husband abandoned me and left me with a tiny newborn baby and 2 small children. And I became a Christian a few years ago, and that's the only thing that's holding this together for me. But I want you to know the reason I became a Christian is because when I was babysitting for you, you had Christian books and Christian music, and we had conversations which stayed with me and were instrumental in me making a decision.
Beautiful.
There was then another young guy called Danny Crossman, who was, again, as a company commander, was one of my young subalterns. I had a letter from him 30 years later saying, I'm now a vicar in Canada, been ordained, and I just wanted to write to you to let you know that the conversations you had with me back in it was about 1984, something like that, 84, 85, were instrumental in me making my decision. And I've got to be careful. I don't want to be overly, it's not about me. But nonetheless, the fact that they'd had those conversations and the example of my leadership and the way that I talked with them about my Christian faith. We can easily forget the seeds that we sow often take a while to the parable of the seeds and so on. So, sowing those seeds. And the great lesson of the parable of the sower is keep on sowing the seeds. Yeah. Because they grow, they generate, and so forth. And those 2 stories, and I've met Helen subsequently. She subsequently became the boss of the Salvation Army in Aberdeen, and I went up to Aberdeen and did some stuff with her up there. And a wonderful young lady, or now, not quite so young, and Danny running his ministry in Canada. So, having conversations like that, you never know where they're going to lead. Keep on sowing seeds.
Amen. Wonderful.
And then, normal day-to-day stuff, in inverted commas, peace back in the UK, back in Germany, serving, in a normal tour as opposed to being on an operation. The decisions that, being called to make. So, I mean, I remember being rung up by a very senior officer telling me that an officer who worked for me had been misbehaving and that I should do something about it. And in the end, cut a long story short, I had to get legal advice from the army legal people and from the military police. And their advice was that I should send this officer home and have an inquiry conducted by the legal guys. And I shouldn't speak to him. I should just send a message saying you got to go home. And I said, this is ludicrous. I mean, I'm not sending one of my officers home without them understanding what's been going on here. And again, to cut a long story short, I was strong advice. You mustn't talk to him and to be fair, from a legal point of view, they were worried about the process and what that would look like and et cetera, et cetera. And I just said, look, get him over here. I want to talk to him. I want to explain what's going on, and then he will go home, and then we will conduct the inquiry. And he had behaved badly and he needed to be dealt with. And in the end, he was. But it was just a process that was interesting. And the feedback from that, from people and he said to me subsequently, the only good thing that came out of that process was the fact that you were prepared to talk to me and explain to me what was going on. So the way that, I disciplined my soldiers, my officers, the way that I tried to lead them, I hope was a reflection of the fact that, as Sanders had taught me, to love them, to have the privilege of serving them, and to make sure that they were looked after well and led, with a strong moral base. And to be clear, I failed miserably on a constant basis. I mean, the bottom line is we all fail miserably on a constant basis, but the intent, trying to do that, to live it out over those years, growing in maturity and so on.
Folks, I am so excited to tell you about the new Inspired book. Basically, we've done about 200 episodes now, packed with mind-blowing stories. And so we approached by the fantastic publisher 10 of those to get some of them down on paper. So we've taken the stories of 8 former guests, each one very different, but connected by one thing, that they're being used beautifully by God to share the gospel of hope around the world. That could be in the jungles of Brazil or the mountains of Cambodia or in the slums of Uganda. I don't know about you, but I grew up on some of the old classic missionary stories. It could be Chasing the Dragon or God's Smuggler or The Cross and the Switchblade. And my hope is that this book will be a similar inspiration to a new generation. I genuinely think teenagers like my kids would find it really engaging. These are modern day stories of the unsung heroes of the faith. So if you want to pre-order, you can go to greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired book to grab one copy or multiple copies to pass it around. That's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired book. I'm really excited. Bring it on, and all the proceeds will go to our ministry, which is helping the poorest of the poor. It's a privilege to be able to share these stories. And on that note, let's get back to the podcast. Now, I'm not a soldier, but I've lived in a war zone for years and seen some grim things. And it's interesting, isn't it, when you're in a refugee camp, and you built actually a refugee camp for 60,000 people with your team. It's the stories of the one. You've got the massive, seething, suffering humanity, and then your eyes move in on one person.
Yeah.
You got any stories of people that just powerfully impacted you?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I did those early tours in the Balkans and then went back as a brigadier, commanding a brigade, to deploy to Kosovo. Again, from a political point of view, there's a lot of background to this, but bottom line is Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, deployed 2 British brigades, one of which was mine, on the basis that there would be some sort of peace agreement reached at a conference that was going on in France at the time, at Rambouillet, rather like the Dayton Agreement that brought the initial Balkan conflict to an end. So we deployed the brigades. Rambouillet fails. I moved my brigade up through Macedonia into Macedonia out of Greece, and we prepared. We started to do some training and prepared to move into Kosovo, which we thought we were going to do initially. And then NATO started bombing Serbia, and a huge refugee crisis broke out. And it was interesting for several reasons, really. One is it was the Easter weekend, so reminiscent of my earlier story. But I then got approached by an American chap who was running the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Kosovo. leading a very small team. And I don't know how he found me, but he did. And he came up to me and said, we've got real trouble and I need help. And I got to know him quite well for various reasons, obviously. But he said to me afterwards, he hated approaching a military organization because he was a classic humanitarian. And he thought that the military, and which is largely true, are often the cause of the problems around the world, not the solvers of it. But anyway, I went with Joe to the border, saw a vast array of refugees, or at that stage, internally displaced people sitting on the border. It was cold, raining, they were hungry, they were out in the open. They were basically being kicked out of their homes by the Serbs. Literally, doors were being knocked on at 10 o'clock at night, and they were being told, if you're not out of here by the morning, we will come back and kill you. So, tens of thousands of people on the move. So I went back and sort of try to think, okay, what does this mean for us? And then I got a phone call from the Macedonian minister, foreign minister. Again, how he found my telephone number in the mass of all of this, I've got no idea. Other than I genuinely believe, this was the Lord, this was God, enabling this conversation to happen. Because there were other senior officers, more senior than me. Anyway, the Macedonian minister said to me, if we let these people into Macedonia, can you guarantee that you can look after them and make sure that they don't end up by going elsewhere in Macedonia? Which may sound a bit harsh, but every country in the Balkans had war, civil war, and they were desperately worried that the civil war could break out in Macedonia. So I found myself literally standing in a field with this cap saying, can you guarantee this? I had no idea how we were going to deal with this. But I suddenly found myself saying, yeah, we that's fine, we'll do it. And I didn't hear God speak to me, but I just knew instinctively that this was a humanitarian imperative. Somebody needed to deal with this. And the fact that he had reached me, that Joe had found me, that in that 24, 48-hour period, I'd been put into that place, made me realize I needed to step into this. And it's, I hesitate to say it, but, for me, it was a sort of Joshua Gideon type moment where I just had to respond. And we ended up by building the camps. And in the context of your point, that mass of people, if I found that if I didn't go out every day and meet and talk to individuals and pray with them, even though they were Muslims, and also then try to do what I could to help reconnect families. So we had a lady who we met who'd lost her daughter in the mass of chaos and uncertainty on that border when she'd been picked up and put in buses. Again, it's a long story we haven't got time to go into, but brought to the camps that we were then building. Her daughter had gone missing. And subsequently, I was told by the commander of KFOR to take a tactical headquarters to Albania, where we were then doing a reconnaissance to possibly build refugee camps, which we did to a degree. But whilst we were there, a sergeant major from my engineer regiment came up to me and said, I think we found Iona. I think we found this little girl. I said, how do you know? He said, I don't know. I just think she's the daughter of that lady we were speaking to. So I got her in. I then said to the UN man there, what do we do to reunite this family? And he then said, oh, well, we'll write a report. We'll send it to Geneva, da-da-da-da-da. I said, okay, thanks very much for that. And he was a lovely bloke, and he was only telling me what needed to be done. And I said to my sergeant major, get the helicopter. And got my helicopter, put the little girl in the helicopter. To be honest, I need to be careful what I'm saying here, but actually, in a way, breaking international law, because I moved from Albania into Macedonia. Anyway, we brought this little girl, and they got hold of the mother and the two other little children that she had, and took them into a medical facility that we'd set up there with my medical regiment, and brought this little girl into the tent. And I tell you, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. I mean, it was just wonderful, wonderful moment. And there are other stories. We found two boys who'd been separated from their parents, who my chief of staff subsequently found inside Kosovo. To be able to do that sort of thing, to make a difference to individual lives amongst that massive uncertainty and chaos and so on, I think, it certainly really mattered to me. It was important for me. And, thank the Lord we were able to do that. I mean, there were lots of very sad stories too. We had people dying, obviously. We had lots of newborn babies in our medical facilities. So it was an extraordinary experience and a searing experience, but a positive one for me personally.
Just, I'm thinking of being smuggled into an internally displaced camp in Burundi, and the rebels had just sent down the chopped off heads of soldiers they'd killed, and they were
Yeah.
just a few hundred yards away up in the hills. And it was very dangerous. I wasn't meant to be there. I wasn't meant to know. I mean, the international community wasn't really aware that they were, because of government policy. And these soldiers who were from one ethnic group had gone through all the tin huts of the refugee camp, piercing the roofs with their bayonets so that when it rained, people would get wet more and die quicker. It was the living dead, no toilets, cholera, killing people every day. And it was one of those humbling moments of my life, because, well, I preached and I lift my eyes to the hills, looking across the lake to the Congolese mountains. I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? In a living hell. And my help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And then a whole bunch of people responded. It was because I think when you know you're going to die, you want to be ready, don't you, to meet your maker.
Yeah.
And then they took me into this hovel, and I was fed what was the most costly meal of my life. I mean, it was one of the most disgusting as well. People who were dying were giving me their rice and beans, sort of soaked and swimming in oil, palm oil, and it was repulsive. And I didn't really want any, but it was like, this is the holiest, one of my holiest moments of my life, being with people who are dying, feeding me, giving me their everything out of their nothing, as often we give our relative shrapnel out of our gross affluence. And they said, you need to get out of here quickly. And I jumped on the motorbike and came across a bunch of soldiers, blood on the road. They'd just been on the job. It was so intense. You know, when you think you're going to die, or you know that it's likely you might die, you live life differently, don't you? And you've been in that situation many more times than me.
No, you're absolutely. And scripture then, I think, becomes important. I mean, my favorite psalm is Psalm 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. If an army should surround me, and even then I will not fear, for you, Lord, are with me. Wherever I go, you are there. And that psalm was one that's resonated with me over the years. And actually, I have to say too, I had prostate cancer, which my prostate was taken out, and it was luckily wasn't all that severe, but nonetheless the prostate was taken out. But as they wheeled me into the operating theatre, that psalm was the psalm that I was speaking, praying. Wherever I go, you are there, and that ability to, within the fear. I mean, as we said earlier, all of us are afraid of something. I have actually met somebody who claimed they'd never been afraid, and that's a different story. But most of us, if not all of us, are afraid of something. And again, it's when we're under that pressure of fear, how we respond to that, how we then bring forth the courage, both the moral, particularly, and the physical courage to enable us to deal with that situation. And we shouldn't be embarrassed about being afraid, but we should always recognize that. I mean, in those sort of situations you describe, and some of the situations that I described, or I've lived through, this could be the last day. This could be the end. And if it is, what does that mean for me and for the family and so on? And we don't need to be somber and despairing about that. Just a reality. Health can hit us badly overnight, but as it does for a lot of people. And when you've got cancer, the last thing you think about at night and the first thing you think about in the morning is, where's this taking me? Where am I going here? And that's why, the faithfulness of God and those experiences of His presence is, I just think, it's a wonderful part of being a Christian. And I just look at people who aren't and think, how do you get through life without anything to hang on to, any hope of what the good Lord brings to us.
And I think of scriptures in terms of the sting of death is taken away. Where death is your victory, where death is your sting. Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Philippians 1:21. I remember driving along a road and on the most dangerous roads in the world, and my colleague looking across with a glint in his eye saying, "Simon, isn't it exciting? We are immortal until God calls us home." It's good to know where you're going, to have that complete peace and security, isn't it? Now, just moving on, I want to talk about the invasion of Iraq. I know you slept alongside your men. You didn't take off your boots for days on end. Go on, tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in the first Iraq campaign, in which, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the UN passed a resolution, and we went in and got rid of him, kicked him out. But of course, we didn't then go on to do anything about that regime. And all choices carry consequences, and the consequences of that choice, which actually I think at the time, to be fair, was right. Nonetheless, hundreds of thousands of people died in the intervening 12 years till 2003. And I know the invasion of Iraq is very controversial. But the bottom line is, I was in Baghdad in 2003. after the military campaign. I'd been in Washington, then been in Kuwait, and then moved into Baghdad as the statue came down in Baghdad. And to be honest, I then lived through strategic failure. I mean, what I saw there was failure in spades, and I now lecture on failure about what that looks like, and we might talk about that. But it was a very, very difficult time, emotionally and physically, very demanding, and just having to live day by day in pretty tough conditions. But actually, to link the two conversations, really, there were some wonderful moments. From Baghdad, I went off to the Kurdish region, and I won't go into that aspect of it. But on the way up to the Kurdish region, we passed an area of burning desert. Quite a big area of burning desert, several rugby fields. And I got my driver to pull in, and we there were a couple of locals there, and we went over and said, what's this burning? Why are all these flames? And without a hesitation, without a heartbeat, the local said, oh, this is the place that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were thrown into the fiery furnace, which was extraordinary. I mean, this was over the northern oil fields, and the gas from the northern oil fields had come through the sand, and these flames had been burning literally for thousands of years. Iran had used them as a marker to bomb Baghdad in the Iran-Iraq war back in the 1980s. So that was a moment, and it got me to think about that. And then to tie it into, I then went down to Babylon and to Nebuchadnezzar's palace. And of course, Babylon is the place that Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were taken into captivity. And that whole story. So sitting and reading that, it just brought the whole thing to life. But it also made me think about where is the line beyond which I am not prepared to go. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Daniel, of course, had basically become senior civil servants, and they'd adopted the language. It was an alien culture, etc., etc. These were youngsters kidnapped into a completely alien world, but they got stuck in and they survived and got on with it. And then one day they are told they have to do something which they're just fundamentally not prepared to do: bow down to this statue and worship it. And of course, Daniel is told at certain stages, so you're not allowed to pray. So what's Daniel's response to not being allowed to pray? He gets on his knees and prays. What's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response to not being able to having to bow down and worship? We will not bow down to this God. And in Babylon, you can see the friezes of the gods that the Babylonians worshipped, and Nebuchadnezzar's palace, etc., etc. But it really struck me as being, what is it that I am not prepared to bow down? Where's the line beyond which I will not go? There's a great story, but a very sad story of a Cambodian church, which is surrounded by Pol Pot's regime, a small church, and the soldiers kick the door in, come in, go to the front of the church, pick up the cross, throw it from the altar, throw it on the floor, and they say to the congregation, you will now leave, and as you leave, you will spit on the cross, and you will never come back here again. And the story, and I think it's a true story, is that people slowly got up, went forward, spat on the cross, and left. And may have been all sorts of good reasons why that was their decision. But the story, the heartbeat of the story is of a young girl aged about 13, 14, who went up to the front, knelt by the cross, and said, I can never spit on my Savior. And they put a bullet through her head. And I often ask myself, would I have left that church alive? Would I, with Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, being prepared to face the fiery furnace and say, our God is able to save us, but even if he does not, we will not bow down to this statue. Yeah. So what does that look like in today's world for me, for you, for the guys listening? What are the issues beyond which we're just not prepared to go? And it's a very demanding question, and I don't have any easy answers. But nonetheless, it's a question I ask myself quite often.
Yeah. Whew. I remember as the war kicked off in 2003, I went to a UN friend of mine's house, and he had on Al Jazeera, Sky News, BBC, and CNN, and they were covering the same event from radically different angles. And it was a salutary lesson to me, I was I was so angry living in a war, seeing the effects of war, and it just seems so unplanned. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but I know that you were very critical post regime change, weren't you? And sort of vociferous in sort of highlighting major catastrophic misplanning management.
Yeah, it was a tough time, and as I said earlier, it was strategic failure. I had originally been involved in the military planning. I won't go into that, but the military planning for the potential, what was then the potential invasion back in 2002. And I was then sent by the Chief of the General Staff to Washington to join a small post-war planning team based in the Pentagon in Washington. And that brought me into contact with all sorts of people, including having lunch with Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of State for Defense, and a number of senior military. And in that conversation, amongst others, being asked, what did I think about what was going on? And I said to Rumsfeld, I don't think there's a doubt we're going to win the military campaign. I got no doubt about that at all. The question is, what happens then? And the question was, I talked about the fact that in Northern Ireland, we had 27,000 British soldiers in Northern Ireland at one point in the 70s, a very small province. The Kosovo campaign, we had 60,000 in Kosovo, very small place. The plan at the time was that once the invasion had happened and Saddam had gone, the Americans were going to reduce to around 150,000 and then come down a bit below that. We, the Brits, who were going in with 50,000, would come down to about 10,000. Iraq is a huge place. And the plan that once they got rid of Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi people would stand up, give a thunderous round of applause, and somehow become a democracy was just bizarre. And in the Chilcot inquiry, and my expression was, the plan was, this is Rumsfeld and the military plan, the political plan, the plan was, we don't need a plan. Everything will be fine. And I said to Rumsfeld, that may be plan A, but what's plan B? What's plan C? And you're going to have to use the international community. You're going to have to use the UN. You're going to have to use the aid agencies and so on. They were just not interested. So there was extraordinary naivety about what was going on. And, when I got into Baghdad, day by day, you began to see this thing crumbling for all sorts of reasons we haven't got time to go into. So yeah. I'm not critical. I have to say, I am not sad that Saddam Hussein went. He was a brutal thug. And his regime was a brutal regime, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And I therefore have no problem with him being kicked out. But the lack of thinking and planning, and the extraordinary assumptions that were being made for that post-war era, what we call phase 4 of a campaign, was naive at best. And the consequences, of course, we're living with even today.
Yeah.
So it was not a happy time.
No, I'm holding back from splurging a lot. I just felt so much anger when you see the suffering in a war, and obviously it's women and children and the decades that have ensued. Anyway, let's move on from that, because you leave the army in 2007. You've obviously got a lot of influence and respect in the international community. You're called in on lots of levels. I'm just aware of time now. As a Christian, how do you feel like the last stretch has been?
It's been great. Let me tell you one story. The beginning of all of that, Christian and I had lived in something like 23 houses during our military. And we'd been married in 1972. We've just had 52 years of married life. But in that process in the military, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, a lot of people have said, you must buy a house. You've got to buy a house and settle in a family and so forth. House prices were rocketing in the 1980s, and inflation was very high, and interest rates were all that sort of stuff. But without being, super spiritual about it, Christian and I chatted about this, and my response to people was, we're not buying a house. I have got my wife and my family with me. Wherever we go, we travel together, we live together, we'll be together. When the time comes, we will find a house to live in. And the Lord bless that. I mean, he was very faithful to us. I was sensible. I saved money and, invested and all that stuff. But when we left, we started looking in 2006. We left in 2007, and we bought a house in June 2006, which we're living in now. And the money that we needed was there. And I'm not, I stress that I fail constantly in this whole business of trying to live in the Christian life. But the Lord is faithful, and when the intent is to do our best to serve Him, then He, I think, is always faithful to us. And we now have a wonderful house, which we've been in for the last, whatever it is, 17, 18 years. when I left, I didn't want to work for a big organization. I felt very clearly that I wanted to work within. I'd become a lay minister, so I wanted to work in the church that we'd been going to for a number of years, on and off. Um, I just found I was approached by a number of people to be involved, and I therefore developed a portfolio of stuff. I was the Army Advisor to the House of Commons Defence Committee for a number of years. I was on the board of 4 businesses. I'm now still on the board of a couple of those. So there was a business plate of what I was doing, which was literally being on the board of companies, chairing an ethics committee of a global engineering company, being involved in that sort of stuff. Then there was a sort of intellectual piece, going back to my earlier comment about being a head-driven bloke. I was visiting professor at a couple of universities, 3 universities, and lecturing a lot at universities. And then there was a sort of piece which was the humanitarian, the church, speaking at men's breakfasts and dinners and so forth. So those 3 plates overlapping, and I felt very strongly very early on that my strap line connecting those 3, which is what I talk a lot about as I lecture and so forth, is morally courageous leadership. That's what we need in our politics, in our businesses, in our churches, et cetera, et cetera. And morally courageous leadership is different to physical courage. But that strap line is what carried me through. And the truth is, the emails come, and I'm asked to go and lecture and speak at events and so forth. And I just love it. I think it's what the Lord's called me to. I loved speaking to men at men's breakfasts. I love preaching, which I do a lot with the church, but also in other churches around the country. And it's taking the gospel to people and trying to encourage them, to challenge them, to challenge them to make a decision. One of the things I feel very strongly about is that everybody is a person of faith. Everybody. They all see the world through the prism of their beliefs. My prism is Christ, and I see the world through the prism of Christ. But atheists, agnostics, humanists, whoever they are, they all see the world through their own prism. They take that with them into the world. And sadly, for so many, that prism, frankly, is themselves. And they talk about being true to themselves, this sort of, rather silly Girl Guide's promise. I promise to be true to myself. Well, I assume that Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Saddam Hussein, Milosevic, all these other hoods that I've been dealing with over the years, all thought they were being true to themselves. Being true to myself is a dangerous place to be. I need to be true to Christ and do my best to serve him. And so challenging people, going out and speaking the Gospels, and Christ is a wonderful example of leadership. I mean, he's a morally courageous, physically courageous guy. He's just a wonderful, and bringing that to men, particularly, is where I think, where my heart is really, and it's a great privilege to do it.
Amen. Well, you're 73 years young. You mentioned about recovering from prostate cancer, so still loads of life in you yet. We'll put your details on the blurb in terms of, just you're mentioning men's breakfast and getting you along to talk. That's how we first came across. Well, it wasn't a men's breakfast; it was a youth event actually, about 10 years ago, wasn't it? In Chorley Wood. But listen, if I got a parting shot from Tim Cross, what would you want to say to us?
Well, I think one of the quotes that I often use is a Sun Tzu quote, and a guy called Lao Tzu, about 2,500 years ago. Sun Tzu said that if you understand yourself and understand the enemy, you need not fear the outcome of 1,000 battles. Understanding the enemy is not easy, and we could talk about that. But the most important, I think, in the context of the conversation is understanding ourselves. General Franks, who commanded 7 U.S. Corps in the first Gulf War, made a statement that I happened to hear with the guy who was commanding the 1st UK Division, General Rupert Smith. And General Franks talked about exactly that, understanding who we are, because understanding who we are is a key part of leadership. So I think the challenge for all of us is exactly that. Who am I? Now, we could have a long conversation about this, but in simple terms, many would argue it's nature and nurture. It's the genetics, the DNA of my heritage, and it's the nurture, how I was raised as a child, the siblings, the school, etc. I use the expression or use the example of that as being the hand of cards that the good Lord has dealt me. It's the DNA, the genetics, and the nurturing is learning how to play the cards. It's the hardware and the software of life, in inverted commas. And many people would say that's it. And I may have been dealt a hand of cards, which is a couple of small pairs. You may have been dealt 3 kings, but I could still beat you in a poker game if I learn how to play my cards well. And there's a lot of truth in that, of course there is. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story for me is the spiritual bridge that bridges the nature, the nurture, the hardware, the software. And that means that the Lord can rewrite the software. He can take the nurture and change it. He can actually replace some of the hardware in real terms. That's what Jesus did when he was healing people. So I think understanding who I am is a key part, because if I don't understand who I am, then I cannot possibly learn to serve and to lead others in the battles of life. My favorite quote for leadership is winning the hearts and minds of people in order to achieve a common purpose. Winning hearts, winning minds, in that order. Winning hearts, winning minds, in order to achieve a common purpose. But the first heart and mind we have to win is our own. And if I don't win my own heart and mind, I'm never going to have the confidence to lead others well. And that winning heart and mind for me has been that whole process from the garden tomb over the last 50 years or 40 years, understanding better who I am and being prepared to recognize that I have got tremendous skills and talent that I was dealt with by the Lord, but I've got serious weaknesses. I've got serious things that I'm not good at, and I need to recognize the reality of that. And when I fail, understand, unlike Judas to go and commit suicide, unlike Pilate to wash my hands of the failure, unlike Aaron who decided to blame everybody else other than himself, I have to recognize my failure is my own. And like Peter, I can be restored and I can move on and I can learn more about myself as a result of what I've experienced. And I learned a lot from Baghdad about who I am and what that meant. So I just encourage people to understand who they are, what their great strengths are, what they need to develop in terms of their weaknesses. And then from there, be in a strong, safe position. The knowledge that God loves me, not just the vicar or you, but he loves me and he died for me, and that I can live on the basis of that solid foundation, that he is with me wherever I go, is the greatest thing for me anyway, that enables me to move on in life.
Oh, man. Great. Well, listen, it's been a real treat having you, Tim, and God bless you as you continue serving him, as you continue being called on regularly in the media as well, and people, that clear gospel, consistent man of integrity witness that you're putting out there. I really appreciate you. You're a role model to many, and cheering you on in all you do. Enjoy your kids, your grandkids, now a great grandfather. So blessings on the next generation.
Thank you.
Bless you, and I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing, Mike Sandin for the mixing. I'd love you to give us a great review on Spotify, iTunes, and share this podcast far and wide. And next week, another fantastic guest, a very different journey. But in the meantime, God bless you, and toodaloo.